Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Duranick, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at Bashor Children's Home over in Goshen, Indiana. I also have had the privilege for the last 9 years of being an adjunct faculty in the School of Social Work teaching here on the IU South Bend campus in the MSW program. And I'm so excited to have you here for this discussion, but also as we work to continue to partner together, multiple agencies, the School of Social Work, to bring you education, continuing education, and on topics that hopefully are of particular interest to the community. So I am excited to be able to introduce you to our panelists, and first I want to do a little bit of housekeeping, okay? First of all, there's a great breakfast spread back there. There's juice, there's coffee. Please help yourself to it. We will have a break about halfway through, which will be another great time to grab a snack if you need to, but definitely want to encourage you to take advantage of that. The restrooms, if you need them, are down to your left, and just follow them all the way around, and you'll be able to find those without a problem. As mentioned, about halfway through, we're going to take a break, okay? Now, when we get going, there's going to be a slide up here that's going to give you a phone number to text. And so that is so if you have questions as we are going this morning, please text them. We will kind of go through them, try to make sure that we don't repeat ourselves, but at the break we'll get some questions, and then coming back we're going to take those questions and answer the questions that you all may have. In addition, you'll have an opportunity even through that second half of this to continue to text questions in, and we will answer as many as we are able, but really we want this to be interactive, right? We're going to give you information, but then we want to hear what questions do you have on these topics, and make sure that we answer them, because you've got some amazing experts here today who are the right people to give you that information. In addition, I already mentioned sign in and sign out. Very important that you do both, and then that you scan to get your CEUs, and we'll cover that again here at the end. So with that being said, I'm excited to introduce you to our panelists, and you can see a little bit of information about them. Well, we didn't end up with it over your heads. We did end up correctly this way. So first I'm going to introduce Justine Wise. Justine is a clinical social worker, and she has been at Bashor Children's Home for over a decade. I think we decided it was about 12 years, right? About 12 years in a wide variety of roles. But in her current role, she oversees program operations and clinical services for our program that provides treatment for survivors of human trafficking. And she wouldn't say this, but I will, because it's very true. She is a leading expert in the state of Indiana in the treatment and provision of treatment for individuals who are survivors of human trafficking. We got right over Rebecca, so that's correct. Here you go. Rebecca, also a clinical social worker, Rebecca Shetler-Fast. She's the president and CEO of CAPS, with over 15 years of experience responding to the trauma needs of vulnerable children, and a role as a trauma clinician, a researcher, a leader. She began her career as a clinical social worker, working in PTSD and substance abuse disorders, and helping to provide care to individuals who were suffering from those. And then, last but not least, Ian Hurst. Ian is with ITVAP, which is a program of Indiana Youth Services Association. And Ian's been in the field since about 2008. You can see, Ian, you've done basically everything I think you can do in the field before you came here, right? Juvenile probation, case management, therapeutic foster care, and has been with ITVAP since 2016, covering the North Central and Northwest Indiana regions in his role as a regional coalition coordinator. And so, very excited to have all three of you here. As we get going, some of you have been my students or are my students. You know I love this quote. I use it all the time. But I think for our purposes today, this really sets us up well, right? Bessel van der Kolk has done a ton of research into the impact of trauma on the body, on the brain. Has this quote: "The greatest source of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves." And what he's really talking about in this section of his book is that society perpetuates its own suffering by the lies we tell ourselves. And I think that this quote is really important for us to think about today, because what we want to do is do away with the fiction. Do away with the stories that may fire us up but aren't helpful, they aren't true, and instead we want to get to the root of the issue, right? We want to get down, dispel those lies, shine light on the truth so that we together can stand in the margins with the marginalized. We together can be a part of the change that can help reduce and ideally eliminate, right, some of these sources of suffering in society. And certainly child abuse, neglect, and leading up to and including human trafficking is a tremendous example of the ills that society suffers from. So I wanted to kind of position our entire discussion today through this quote, and we'll go ahead and get started. And so as promised, if you have questions, please text them. Also, there are some resources. I'll leave that QR code up there. You can scan that for some resources from both CAPS and ITVAP. But welcome, everybody. Glad to have you all here. So my first question is going to be for you, Rebecca, if you want to grab the mic. You're up first. What I'd like to do is give our crowd here a little bit of an idea of definitions of child abuse and neglect, and then definitions of human trafficking. So would you start off, just define child abuse and neglect for us?
Thanks, Mike, and it's good to be here. Can I say a little blooper before I start? I was walking around lost on campus, as is my custom, and I walked into the admissions department, a little out of breath, like, really got to get to this presentation. I said, "I'm here for trafficking." And they looked at me like, what is this person? This is not a topic, anti-trafficking. I kind of had to add anti. So, classic. I work and I get to lead an organization that focuses on child abuse prevention and response, CAPS, and we're the largest, sorry for the echo, umbrella organization doing that in Indiana. And so as part of that, on the prevention end, one of that is identifying how Indiana code defines child abuse. So I'll start with neglect, which at this point, statistics in the state tell us about 85% of founded child abuse is neglect. And so that's failure of a parent or caregiver to provide basic needs. So basic needs are food, or shelter, mental health care, physical care, education, and those basics. Poverty is not neglect, however, the inability to provide those. And right now, especially in Elkhart County in our region, because of the softening economy, we have really high rates of neglect. That's a trend we're seeing. So just kind of as a note on that. Emotional abuse is failure of a caregiver to provide for the cognitive, emotional, psychological well-being and development of a child. And this one, and I just kind of warn you, it's a really hard one to substantiate, which is a fancy word for us to confirm this was abuse. It often more coincides with other types of abuse, and even if it's there's really hard to prove in court, and those of you in the field may understand that. So we need a psychologist testifying to that, and our stats are very low on founded cases of emotional abuse. So again, we're more looking at emotional abuse in conjunction with other forms of abuse. Physical abuse, act, omission of a caregiver that causes bodily injury to a child. And so types of physical abuse, there's a wide range. We'll start with our youngest age kids. So you may know this, but infants to 11 months old are highest risk for physical abuse, and shaken baby syndrome is something you may have heard of, the kind of a very dramatic example of that. Biting. In the state of Indiana, it is illegal to physically discipline your child. However, when there is bodily injury, so that there's significant pain or bruises, that can cross the threshold, and that's again defined by Indiana State Code and interpreted by DCS. Biting, physical injuries, significant injuries, and failure to provide medical care for that. Sexual abuse is something we'll be chatting about more today in the context of trafficking, and it's a big umbrella. And one of my main points that I hope you take away from today is CSEX, so commercial sexual exploitation of children, trafficking, sexual trafficking, falls under the umbrella of sexual abuse of children. So one of the things I'm passionate about people understanding in the community is that if we prevent childhood sexual abuse, we prevent sexual exploitation of children. And so child sexual abuse is any time a child is forced to or cannot consent to sexual contact. And as a reminder, in the state of Indiana, children who are under the age of 16 cannot consent, even if it's with a peer, and that's an interesting loophole that not all states have, so that's important. There's other sub-definitions of this. A child can't consent if they're emotionally incapacitated, if they're under the influence, if they're unconscious for sexual contact. And I think I'll pass it over to Ian to continue definitions, if that's okay.
That would be great. And I'm being told that if we hold the mics away from our face a little bit more, they will pick us up and we'll have less feedback. So there you go. This is live, everybody. So yeah, Ian, a little bit more about definitions for trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children.
Sure, of course. Good morning, everybody. Mike, thanks for the introduction. Thank you, IU, for hosting. So the human trafficking definition is interesting because before the year 2000, the crime of human trafficking didn't exist as a law, as a crime. It was happening, but it was called kidnapping or something likewise. So in the year 2000, Congress got together and created what's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and it sought to better define what was actually going on with human trafficking. What they created was the AMP model: action, means, and purpose. These are the three things that need to be in place for it to be the crime of human trafficking. So action would be buying, selling, soliciting, things like that. Means would be force, fraud, or coercion of the victim. And then the purpose would be either sexual exploitation, commercial sexual conduct, or labor trafficking. So to say all that, the definition as it exists right now is human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into any work or service against their will. It's equated to modern day slavery. There are two types of trafficking. There's sex trafficking and labor trafficking, kind of self-explanatory, but sex trafficking involves commercial sexual exploitation, and that can be, is my time up? That can be an exchange of sexual contact for anything of value. Kind of one of the myths of human trafficking is that it has to be for money. It does not. Anything of value can constitute trafficking, whether it be electronics, goods, or services. Something to eat that's of value. A place to sleep for the night is of value. And then labor trafficking moves into exploiting someone else's labor for another's profit by those means of force, fraud, and coercion. Another great point to understand when we're talking about definitions and things like that and laws is that anyone under the age of 18 cannot be arrested for prostitution in the state of Indiana. What that means is there is no such thing as a youth prostitute in Indiana. It is always a crime. They are always a victim. Case in point, I worked with a 17-year-old male. He was posting pictures of himself online for encounters with other males. No one was forcing him to do it. No one was being fraudulent. No one was coercing him to do it. Because of the nature of his actions and his age, he could have been considered a victim of human trafficking. Does that make sense? So one of the kind of rumors that I always want to dispel right there is youth prostitution does not exist in Indiana. When we were talking about a minor who is sexually trafficked, force, fraud, and coercion do not need to be proven to substantiate or to prosecute trafficking. It is because under the age of 18, Indiana law says a child is not able to consent to that action no matter their age because of overall brain development. They don't have the wherewithal to do that. In labor trafficking cases of any age, force, fraud, or coercion still need to be proven to show that a minor or an adult was labor trafficked.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you both for those definitions. And so I wanted to set the table with what are we talking about today. And now I'd like to move a little bit into some of the data, right? How often are these things happening? Again, we're going to start with the big umbrella here because, Rebecca, as you pointed out, not every child who is sexually abused is trafficked, but every child who is trafficked is sexually abused. And so we want to come out big picture here and talk a little bit about that data. And so can you talk a little bit about just child sexual abuse broadly and kind of that process? How do we look at that?
Yes. So first of all, many of you know, I think this is a room full of social workers, that we have underreporting. So I'm going to give you some stats and data, but you're going to have to bear in mind that these are not the full picture. It's worse or more significant. So nationally, we have a number, we say 1 in 10 children are sexually abused before they become an adult. And again, that's an underreport. Because I'll pair that with the fact that we say somewhere, there's a range and it's hard to know, but 20% or more, but children don't disclose abuse, and the average disclosure happens as an adult. So it's important to think about those numbers in context. In the context of just kind of taking one county snapshot to give you numbers for the last year, we have staff here from our Forensic Interview Center. So forensic interviewing is a process that happens after a hotline report has been made and when a local DCS office or law enforcement says, we think there's merit here to this report of some type of child abuse, which could include commercial sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, etc. So in the last year, in our community in Elkhart County, we had 561 children who we interviewed who were alleged to be victims of crimes. Of those 561, 511 were reports of sexual abuse. And just to kind of give you a sense of the age range, most of our children are falling in the 7 to 12 kind of age range, and 12 plus is our next highest age range for sexual abuse. Thinking about other things we want to know as we think about child commercial sexual exploitation of those children last year, and remember these are underreported numbers, 5 of those cases were substantiated, which again is fancy word for DCS saying this is real, for sexual exploitation of children, so trafficking. And we've talked, these are not the full picture. Maybe I can add some nuance to that and some of the reasons that we don't get as many children either sharing, making a report, or confirming that they've been trafficked. One of the reasons is that it's sometimes a little bit more of a confusing type of sexual abuse. Most of these people are victims of other types of abuse, and sometimes they feel that they're choosing this, that they have self-efficacy. I'm a self-agent of this. We also have, it's confusing because there may be more people linked into that network, other friends, other girls. They may feel like part of this quid pro quo, what they're getting, like again, they are consenting to this. Sharing, they maybe have, and we're gonna hear more about this from Justine, but a connection with their John or their pimp. And so we find that it's unusual to have reports of trafficking before people are 18. It's unusual to have disclosures. Whereas, again, I'm saying it's hard to have kids disclose abuse, but we find more disclosures of other types of abuse. Trafficking is a little, and again, Justine's an expert, it's a little more complicated for victims or survivors, so our numbers are lower on that. I would note as an additional kind of number, of those 5 cases of trafficking we had last year in our community that were substantiated, the broader number from that were 34 referrals for trafficking. So people in the community are more heightened in their awareness of trafficking, although my colleagues in that department say, and maybe Ian would agree, we don't always have a correct understanding of trafficking, so we could continue to refine how we understand what trafficking is. Is that fair to say, Ian? And that's kind of partially why we came here today. We were talking in the community about people want to do something, they're concerned by this, but people need the accurate information, so they send us the accurate cases and they identify it correctly. Other data or questions on that?
Well, I think, what I'm curious about as you're talking through that is, and I want to make sure I'm hearing you right, because I think it's an important point, right? There are many good reasons that we are familiar with, I think, in the field at large, why child abuse and neglect is underreported.
Yes.
And we know that in the national data, we know it locally, we know it from our experience.
Yeah.
But the complexity of a case that ends up being a case of commercial sexual exploitation of a child only increases the likelihood it's going to be underreported for all those factors that you mentioned, and then Justine's going to expound on a little bit. And I think that's just an important point to really drill home.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and we'll get into risk factors later, but the risk factors decrease the likelihood that the teenager is sharing that. And one other kind of risk factor we would add that leads to decreased numbers of reporting is that there is often, at least recently we found gang or criminal activity, and so kids don't disclose abuse for a variety of reasons. Blame, shame, threats are some of the top reasons. For commercial sexual exploitation, threats are a lot more common and they're more serious. There's more weight behind them, and threats to families. And so that's another reason that we have decreased rates of reporting.
And I am curious before, and we're going to go to Ian next, but can you just kind of give a brief explanation for everybody here about the role that CFAC, that your program for the forensic interviewing, does with DCS in trying to determine these cases with law enforcement? I think that if people aren't familiar with that, they may be fascinated to know that multi-agency effort.
Right, so as great social workers and people who care about kids, you're probably some of our likeliest reporters of suspected child abuse. And we all want you to report when you suspect, not investigate. That's the role of professionals. And so every community has a place where they do forensic interviews and they gather, we call them a multidisciplinary team, there's members in this room, to work on a case where we suspect a child has been abused. And so again, you make a hotline report, that gets filtered, goes to a local DCS office. From there, they decide by their algorithm and criteria, do we think this case is valid to move forward? And then the role that we have at CAPS and the Casey Center in St. Joe County is to try to, there's probably a better word, and I have staff here that do this, but extract the testimony and what the child is willing to share in a trauma-informed way, in a developmentally appropriate way, in a way that can hold up in court. So, for example, I can't say, did your Uncle Bob do X, Y, and Z? We can't say that. There's an art and a science to doing, we call them forensic interviews. And in that, we have a member of DCS, local law enforcement, sometimes a prosecutor, watching in closed circuit TV while that forensic interview is going on to understand, A, is the child safe to go home? So that's a DCS decision. Like, is mom able to keep them safe, or whoever the non-offending caregiver? 2, the law enforcement is looking at, can we make an arrest? Like, what is the evidence that we're gathering? And the prosecutor is deciding, can this case move forward? And so that multidisciplinary team, along with support to the non-offending caregiver and child after the fact, it's a much better system that we've had in prior years of trying to be victim or survivor focused and centered to get information without having that child without these centers tell their story 12 times over and over and over. Maybe sometimes at a police department where they kind of feel like they're in trouble, they're already feeling like they're in trouble and something bad is happening. This is not a happy thing for most kids. So that's our process, and in the end, it's DCS's recommendation and our judge or magistrate's decision if that child, what happens and if that child was an alleged, a founded allegation of abuse.
Yeah, and so I think, again, my takeaway there, and I know we'll come back to this, is let the professionals do the investigation, because what I take away as I hear you talk about that is how even the professionals, if we ask a question the wrong way, we might discover that something happened and make it so that it can't be prosecuted.
Absolutely.
And we don't want to do that.
Yes, we want you to, again, so I always think of our barrier is very low, suspect. We talk to churches, we talk to social workers, teachers. If you suspect abuse, make a report. Your job is not to investigate and decide whether it's real or valid. And then, other than the minimal questions to make as a report with as much as you know, we don't want you to ask additional questions because it really can interfere with prosecution, and no one wants that, right? We want these people to be prosecuted. So that's really important, and that's why we have expert staff who can pull that testimony out from that child effectively, so that can hold up in court. It's a really important part of the court process.
Awesome, thank you, Rebecca. So Ian, I'm wondering if you could just share with us a little bit about human trafficking numbers broadly, what ITVAP sees in your community partners and law enforcement, kind of statewide, and then drilling down a little bit locally.
Sure. Before I do that, I'll explain a little bit about how my program works and where we kind of get our numbers from. So we are not a direct service provider. What we do are 3 main things: educational opportunities for social workers, law enforcement, DCS, juvenile probation, youth themselves with a specific curriculum, all kinds of different types of audiences, healthcare, teachers, all that good stuff. Second thing we do is create coalitions in each of our regions to make sure that key stakeholders have a place at the table to talk about community awareness, anti-trafficking efforts, involvement, things like that. And then the third thing we do is create a statewide network of service providers so that we have, if we receive a referral from DCS or law enforcement, we're almost immediately able to turn that young person over for services, whether it be counseling, independent living, short-term, long-term housing. We have that throughout the state. They are contracted service providers with us. And we have, I believe we're up to 65, somewhere right around there throughout the state. So even if we need relocation of a victim for their safety, we're able to find somebody throughout the state. And it is because of those service providers that we come up with the numbers that we see. Since our inception, actually back in October of 2015, we have provided services through our service provider partners, or identified youth that are at high risk for trafficking for over 8,000 youth in the state of Indiana. We have provided services for youth in all 92 counties. I will tell you, I work closely with the FBI of Northern Indiana, and they are very aware and looking for prosecuting, investigating human trafficking cases, Elkhart DCS, St. Joe DCS, again, very aware to the problem of human trafficking. DCX actually created a focus group for human trafficking that runs statewide, and there are, I believe, 5 people dispersed throughout the state to make sure that if a case comes into DCS and it is reported as human trafficking, whether it gets screened out, accepted, and to be investigated by the call center of DCS, the hotline number. If that gets flagged, and those people who are specifically trained on human trafficking take a look at every report that comes across as an HT report to make sure that nothing's falling through the cracks and we can help the youth. Because we know that it is very difficult for them to self-identify through the various factors we've discussed already. I receive referrals from law enforcement, DCS cases I consult on, juvenile probation, a few times every month. I am not overly inundated with referrals. But I think we've explained enough about the factors that are keeping this kind of in the shadows, and the reasons why both youth and adults don't self-disclose as human trafficking victims. That's why you're not seeing these numbers. On a national level and a state level, they are increasing. That's not to say that they weren't happening at the high numbers they are now. It's always been happening. Things like this, educational opportunities that we all provide, allow us to see human trafficking with educated eyes, to recognize what it is, what it isn't, report it, investigate it, things like that. And even in the Midwest, Ohio is almost annually in the top 5 in cases reported and prosecuted, because they do a great job of what we try to do to educate. Like I said, know what it is, know what it isn't, go in there, investigate, and respond appropriately.
Awesome, very good. Well, Justine, I'd like to kind of jump off of that and have you, if you would, just talk a little bit, because Ian talked about we have confirmed cases that we're providing care for, and then we have suspected or high-risk cases. Would you just share a little bit for our audience about the differences there and kind of what you see in that regard?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here today. So what I do and what my team does is more of that direct service provision. So our program is a residential program, and I do want to dispel the rumor that you can't treat survivors of human trafficking in the community. You certainly can. So what our program does is kind of first work to assess on whether or not this is a youth that would benefit from a residential program, meaning are they displaying enough kind of quote-unquote high-risk areas of behavior, so such as high elopement risk, maybe their home or their caregiver isn't safe for them to return to, like Rebecca talked about in terms of some of the DCS investigations. Those are typically the 2 reasons why they aren't able to do that community, the work in the community, because they don't have a safe environment, or they are so dysregulated and so connected to trafficking that they're running away frequently, putting themselves at risk. We serve a lot of kids who've been on the run for sometimes weeks and months at a time, and been in a trafficking or exploitation experience for a significant period of time. So we talked a little bit about why it's hard to get those disclosures. It's even harder, in my kind of opinion, as I've worked with several youth in getting the prosecution end. So a lot of the kids that we work with don't have confirmed, traffickers that have been prosecuted and behind bars, so to speak. We work with a lot of youth where I get constant questions of, this is what this kid is doing, here's some of the red flags that we're seeing, can you meet with this youth to tell us whether or not they are at risk, we have this gut instinct that something's going on. So we bring a lot of those youth into our program under kind of what we call, they're not confirmed, right? Or it's highly suspected, or even youth that are participating in exchanges with particularly older men, internet exchanges, running away. Those would be kids that we consider more at-risk youth. And oftentimes in the process of the treatment program, we are able to, we're gonna get disclosures of trafficking, exploitation, we're gonna get disclosures of additional abuse. We work really closely with CAPS in terms of when those youth do disclose in DCS to make sure that we go through the process of letting DCS investigate, letting the forensic interview happen so that, hopefully we can move forward with keeping this child more safe. But a lot of the youth that we do serve in our program oftentimes won't get a conviction, or they won't go through a prosecutorial situation in a courtroom and get that justice that they need or want. So we oftentimes come back to, it's very survivor-centered. We want to make sure that the youth feel that we hear them, we believe them, and that can be a really hard point for the youth as they're working through treatment with us is, this is going on, and they repeat it to us, this is going on, right? But we aren't able to necessarily find those confirmations, and it's not because of we're all working really hard to get there. It is just very difficult. Do you want me to move into?
I think that's good, and what I was wondering, thank you, Justine. As we do that, you just set the table wonderfully for what we want to talk about next, right? Which is, so we've kind of set the table of what are these definitions and how often does it happen confirmed, but also what are some of the reasons why it may not, those numbers may be kind of out of order, right? Like we say, well, we only have this many confirmed, but we have this many cases. So let's talk about risk factors, right? And I want to first go to Rebecca here, and I want to look at child sex abuse risk factors broadly, and then we're going to come back to Justine and then Ian. We're going to drill into what are some things that are a little bit different that we want to look at for cases of potential commercial sexual exploitation.
Well, and maybe I can start, if I narrow it a little bit into commercial sexual exploitation and broaden that, because I can say, anecdotally, if we think of all the children that we saw in 2023 who were trafficked, 3 things they all had in common that were disclosed trafficking. So 1, a runaway history. And this is the biggest red flag that if you can take with your practice and if you're not aware, runaway is just a red flag for us all. Something is wrong, whether it's some type of abuse, and absolutely, all the children had that. It also, can I note, can you think of how vulnerable a child it is? When Ian did such a nice job of explaining commercial exploitation is not just giving money. So I'm a runaway child. Boy, the threshold for me being willing to do something for a safe place to sleep for the night is so small. Can you imagine how that's just such an incredible risk factor? So runaway, again, huge red flag for all of you in your work. Number 2, all of the children we saw last year had a prior history of other forms of abuse. So abuse is the largest risk factor of more abuse, which is a very depressing thing, and also something that we should recognize and take significant action on. So if you're sitting in front of a client who has been abused, they have incredible risk to be abused. Again, we want to move heaven and earth to stop that cycle. And thirdly, we saw also as a trend, and I'm sure Ian sees this in his work, all the children who had been trafficked, again, that we knew of in the last year had a history of grooming. So again, there was preparation with the perpetrator and child pornography, involvement in child pornography. And these are anecdotal, so Ian can give you probably more specifics on that, but I would note that's a cluster we see. And again, what I would stress, prior history of abuse and runaway just being incredible red flags. Just making people vulnerable, and very right, this is an exploitation, right? So I'm just very vulnerable if I don't have a place to sleep, I don't have stable relationships, other factors that contribute to that. If I kind of broaden out those risk factors, so parent actively using, like substance misuse disorder going on in the household, and that leads to supervision issues and all kinds of other kind of problems with that. Unstable living environment. Again, these are things that perpetrators take advantage of. Parental kind of chaos and just higher conflict in the family home. And then Mike, you asked about general risk factors. So for abuse in general, I mean, it's a complicated question, and abuse and neglect have different risk factors than child sexual abuse, so they're a little bit different. So I'm going to say some broad statements on that. But have people heard the term ACEs, adverse childhood experiences? Okay, nodding, that's great. So we look for kids who have had prior history of stressors in their homes. I'm not saying that is predictive. Having, a divorced parent or a parent who misuses substance does not mean you're going to be abused, but they are more vulnerable. And people who prey on children are looking kind of for vulnerabilities. That's an easier way to target children. I'll also note in there kind of risk factors. Kids who have witnessed violence especially is a high risk factor. By age, again, I said at the beginning, our highest risk age for physical abuse is newborn to 11 months, which is depressing, I know. Our next highest age is, again, newborn to age 5. So that's an important thing to know as we think about physical abuse, especially as a risk factor. Age of child. And we can extrapolate that to, it's an intense stage. When I had little kids, those were stressful moments in parenting. And then risk factors on the parent end, the one thing for you to remember is parental stress is the biggest driver for physical abuse and neglect. So that's what we're looking for, and that's what we're trying to mitigate however we can. Parental stress. So I said we're 85 and above for rates of neglect across the state right now for substantiated abuse. Why is that? I'm connecting that to a soft economy, underemployment. That is directly contributing to parental stress. Economics are the biggest driver of that. For child sexual abuse, we get into it's a little bit more nuanced for risk factors. One of the things that is a haunting statistic is 90% and above, and for our county last year, 93% of kids who were sexually abused knew their perpetrator, knew them well. So another take-home nugget, stranger danger in the white van is absolutely a myth. And so that's a haunting statistic, and I think there's a reason that a lot of people kind of try not to think about that, because as a parent, it's nicer to think about strangers being the risk versus someone in my network. And for sexual abuse, I think that's very important to think about. So a lot of when we think about mitigating risk factors, we think about mitigating the environment. For example, in a church, I would tell them, we just don't want opportunities for one-on-one, child and youth, or child and adult. We want to mitigate, have less opportunities where something could happen. So I've gone on, and I could probably go on and on, so I'll stop on risks here.
Sure. See, and I told you all, very knowledgeable panelists here. We could go on for hours for sure. So I am wondering, you mentioned stranger danger, right? And just the fact that the data doesn't bear out that that's really where the main risk comes from. Now, before we move to where the main risk does come from, specific to human trafficking, I'm wondering, could you dispel some myths for us? What are some other myths? Because this is a heavy topic, everybody, right? But there are some things that there are rumors out there, but they are not at all true, right? So can you share a little bit of that for us?
Sure. So the first one I always like to bring up is human trafficking is not the movie Taken. It is not the pretty young white girl in a foreign country being drugged away by foreigners and sold into marriage. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but the vast majority of what we see is not that. It is not the dark alley, panel van, drag you away, kidnapping type stuff either. It is not somebody following you around IKEA or Target or putting flyers under your windshield or cash in your door handle at a gas station. It is not buying furniture on the internet and the certain model of armoire that you buy means that you're getting a 10-year-old boy versus a 12-year-old boy. It is not those things. These are real myths.
Yeah, and
I am not making this up.
This is stuff that you hear, right? In the community.
This is stuff that is spread around the internet, and TikToks and Instagram videos are made of it, that, it's some scared human being followed around IKEA thinking that she's about to be trafficked and whatnot. Again, not saying that can't or doesn't happen. The vast majority of what we see is not that. In the state of Indiana, we partner with the state police. They have never investigated. They have 0 cases of any of those things leading to someone being trafficked. 0 cases. It's never happened in Indiana. What we see is familial and intimate partner trafficking. Every case that I've consulted on has been somebody that the victim knew or became very close friends with through the grooming process. Another rumor is that it is illegal aliens crossing the border, and they're being trafficked, or they're coming here to traffic our kids. 87% of trafficking victims as a nation are domestically born. They are our own sons and daughters. And tragically, they are being trafficked by their own mothers and fathers. Another myth is that it has to involve transportation. We need these big networks of across the country moving. Just because the word trafficking is in the name of it, doesn't mean that you have to have a car. You don't even need a bicycle. A mother or father can traffic their own son or daughter right out of their home, apartment, or motel room. Again, the vast majority of what we see is family and intimate partners. There was a study conducted back in 2016-17 at an unlocked residential facility for minor female victims of human trafficking. And this is when the nation was really starting to learn about human trafficking. Our organization started because when Indy hosted the Super Bowl, a lot of attention was brought to the subject. And we had previously, well, we still do, but we run the youth service bureaus, so like Bashor, Safe Station, and throughout the state. And our organization had that statewide outreach, so the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute approached us about doing an anti-human trafficking program. So that's how we got started, because of the attention of it. So when the study was conducted, the country was just really learning about human trafficking, and it was those myths that it was foreign born and it happened overseas and it's all kidnapping. And the girls were asked, who were you trafficked by? 63% of those girls identified that they were trafficked either by their immediate family or their boyfriends. And I think back then, and still rings true today, it's a great indicator, eye-opener on the reality of human trafficking. And if we think about it, that trafficker, let's use one of those girls as an example. Let's say she's at home, mom and dad are abusive, there's domestic violence going on, there's no dinner being made, there's no help with homework, they don't care if she gets up and goes to school or whatnot. She chooses to run away. We've already said that's an extreme red flag. And she meets this friend, maybe it's a family friend, she knows him, he offers to bring her in, provide her with food, shelter, things like that. And then through the grooming process, he manipulates that situation into her believing that that's her boyfriend. He ends up trafficking her, and she may think that that situation is just how she shows love back into the relationship, that she has these encounters to make money for her and her boyfriend, and it's okay because he loves me, and this is what I do to show my love back to him. Unfortunately, that may be the greatest example of love that girl's ever seen, because her parents didn't care about her. So now, going back to disclosures, we've got this situation where this girl's being trafficked. Her boyfriend is trafficking her. What she thinks is her boyfriend is trafficking her. When we as DCS, social services, law enforcement are made aware of that situation, it's a great barrier to make her realize what she thinks she's a part of versus what she's actually a part of. And that's a great barrier. It's called trauma bonding.
Yeah.
And that's a great barrier for disclosures and things too.
And that actually, it's like you guys are setting me up for this. You didn't even know this is where I was going to go, though. That leads perfectly into where we're going to do one more thing here before we take a break, okay? And I understand that many of you are sending questions, which is awesome, so we're going to look at those. But Justine, we've talked now risk factors. We've talked about how does this happen, right? How do they become known? So my question for you is just a little bit about what do we do, right? They come in, what are the best practice treatment approaches for these children who have been through this, how do you and your team approach that? What should everybody know? And I know, just summarize insanely complex stuff,
I was like, wow, we could be here another hour
There you go. So
or
go
a couple
for it.
days around that topic. So one of the things I do want to bounce off of over here is this is what makes, what Ian just talked about is what makes disclosure and what makes treatment to some degree very complex and very time consuming. I've been very fortunate to hear some adult survivors talk about their own kind of recovery process. So I work primarily with juveniles, so it's nice to hear when adult survivors are telling their story, and they're maybe 10, 15, 20 years out of their exploitation experience, but they're still talking about the day-to-day work that they're doing for recovery. And so I think that's a really pivotal example of how complex and how long kind of recovery takes. And going back to that, it's because of how how that trauma bonding and that connection is so traumatic, and how it wreaks havoc not only on someone's brain, but their body and their whole life. So as you guys spoke about it very beautifully, right? What we do initially is when we meet a child, whether they come in our doors because they've been, we've not met the child before they walk through our space, we've had that. We've also have, I spend a lot of time meeting children ahead of coming into our program, getting to know them and starting that assessment process. And so what I see time and time again is you have these older boyfriends, parents, these people who should be the source of stability, love, support, then in turn, they're the ones providing the abuse, right? They're the ones that are doing the exploitation. And so that rewires a lot of the brain of a survivor into this piece of, well, to show love, right? This is what I do. And so a lot of what we do is we don't come in and say, well, your mom trafficked you and she's bad, right? You can't ever go back to her, she's not. Because at the core of us, right, she's always going to be mom. And we're wired as people to always want to connect. And I think when you think about, especially as a child, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, right? Those people are pretty much the people that they've known their entire lives, right? And whether or not we believe it's healthy or unhealthy or abusive, the child believes and has been wired to say what is going on in that relationship is healthy, it's right, it's what everybody is doing, and it's not wrong. And that's what you said about the complexities, right? So it creates a lot of complexities. So we focus a lot on just kind of as that youth comes in, we want to make sure that their basic everyday needs are taken care of, their clothing, food, shelter, that we're creating a physically safe environment. Because a lot of times that's what has been a driver to the running away or the connection with the exploiter to begin with, is that they are meeting their basic needs, right? And we all need our basic needs to be met, right? We all need that. And so a lot of times our kiddos come in and they struggle to navigate what it looks like to have a room all to your own, and hey, what color of bedding do you like, and what kind of clothing do you like to wear, and making sure that they have the hygiene products that they need and that they're getting regular meals and snacks, and if there's extra food around, so that we make sure that if they're hungry before they go to bed, they have something to eat, right? So they never have to wonder and guess. But that takes time, and we build a lot of trust in that process. So a lot of our first goals are just to build trust, to say we are safe adults, because we have to prove ourselves to be safe adults. What we do, just generally speaking, and as quickly as I can say it, is we build relationships with these youth to show them what safe adults are. And so that takes a lot of time, and that takes a lot of effort of showing up every day. I often say, people ask me, how do you guys keep showing up? It's such hard work. And I always say, well, they're showing up, so we have to, right? They've been through a lot more than I can ever imagine. Because it isn't just about the exploitation and abuse. It's what Rebecca talked about, is these are likely kids who've had a significant amount of other abuse in their life. And so once we establish that trust and that physical safety, that works us towards psychological safety, where you actually feel safe in the space. And at that point, we might be 3 or 4 months into a residential stay before we're really getting to some of the work around trauma work. A lot of our kids have what we call somatic symptoms, or they complain about kind of like a lot of medical issues. My back hurts, my tummy hurts. And some of our youth are very medically complicated as a result of how trauma is stored in their bodies. So once we get that stuff established, we can start working on the trauma work, which we do a variety of different things. Some kids are gonna be more, traditional TFCBT or evidence-based practices in terms of trauma work and therapy, love talk therapy. But then a vast majority of our kids aren't. We're teaching a lot of coping skills, we're teaching a lot of mindfulness, we're doing a lot of body work, which is mainly activities to work out that trauma. But then we're also really looking at the gaps. So these kids are like survivalists, right? And I love their like constant, I'll look at them and be like, they remind me of people that are 5, 6, and 7 years older than their chronological age in front of me, but then they may not know some very basic like skills. And so we were kind of assessing those skill gaps for them as well to help them to make sure that they're kind of not just running everything through their survival brain, but they're actually kind of like learning the skills that they missed at 7 when mom wasn't home to make dinner. And so we work a lot on like independent living and vocational skills as well.
We are ready to get going with some of your questions. The information is back up behind me. I think somebody had asked for that. So we'll go back to the text number here in a second. If you've got a question, don't worry, we'll get there. But we do have some great questions to get started here for our panel. And so thank you and keep them coming. All right. So I think this is a great question, and I'm going to just open it up, and whoever feels inspired to speak on it, just dive in. Everybody go for the mic, but not at the same time. So here's this question. The first question is, what are we doing for our youngest youth, like ages 7 or 8, in high-risk situations or high trauma families for prevention? So that word makes me think, Rebecca, you may want to start reaching for the mic. Very simply, they said, in their experience, there are not many options for support or to address their behaviors, which then impact their school, home, and community. So what are we doing for our youngest youth in these situations to support them and for prevention?
Great question, and you're following that thread. Our youngest kids are more at risk. So I'll say for child sexual abuse, one of the community-wide, we want to be blanketing the community and kids with messages. So a few things we want to do. We want to educate adults, and we want to empower and give kids knowledge. And so in Elkhart County, we were the first county in the state and one of the first in the U.S. to have all public schools, 7 districts, which is no small task, do evidence-based gold standard child safety curriculum. And we were so proud and excited to do that. So it was 3 years ago. So every child, and we even developed a pre-K version, again, in our community, and it's run through a national organization. So starting at age 3 in our community, children are getting messages, 5 safety rules, very simple. Children can't prevent abuse, let me just say that. So I'm not trying to say kids are preventing their own abuse, but they can be empowered to, let's say, disclose abuse, or even better, because we want to go backwards, we teach them spot red flags, which for a 3-year-old means saying, if you have a funny feeling in your tummy, that's okay. We want kids to trust their instincts, because both kids and adults often have instincts and then they override them. Sometimes, as Justine points out, it's because they know the person and they're supposed to be the safe person and they're not. That's very confusing for kids, and that's such an important point Justine's making, because it's trusted people who are most often the perpetrators. So imagine that a kid starting at age 3 all the way to high school, no matter how many schools are bouncing between, we've added on after school programs, this year we're adding on sports programs, they're getting the same messages of safety, tell a safe adult. We end, my favorite safety rule, number 5, that they get from 3 all the way to 18 is no blame, no shame. And why don't kids abuse? I mean, threats are one reason, but most of the time, Justine, they feel this sense that, well, I've agreed, I'm responsible, that icky thing, somehow I consented, and that's really confusing. That keeps so many kids from disclosing. So to your question, I know that was kind of a zoomed out note. It's very hard to kind of do interventions, if the child isn't working with Oaklawn or another service provider, but they are getting consistent education across the community about red flags, talking to a safe adult, what a safe adult is. A safe adult is different than a trusted adult. And Justine used that term, and I was like writing on my notes and exclamation marks there. Trusted adults can violate that trust. And we used to teach kids that topic, but thinking about 93% of kids in our community last year were sexually abused by someone they knew well, that's not a great term. That's very confusing. So we say safe adults, and we give kids a definition in this curriculum. Same definition: a safe adult keeps you safe, doesn't take anything that violates a safety rule or another rule. They listen and they believe you and they act immediately to keep you safe. We also add on to adults, and they regulate their emotions when they hear, right? The kid doesn't need to take care of you. You're not crying in that. So I'd say that's the blanket kind of community level intervention. There's a lot of different programs in St. Joe County, Elkhart County for at-risk kids, and I'm not going to get into all of those, but what we know of kids who are at risk is we want services in their homes, right, and with the family. We want case management services, we want to be layering on services, and we know it's not just for the kid, because the family environment is probably also what's putting them at risk. Did I answer that?
I think so, and so consistent language, so
Consistent
that
language.
kids
And
hear
everyone's
that.
getting it. Even if the family environment isn't great and parents aren't educating them, that's okay. We have school counselors, social workers, coach after school, daycare teacher, after school program. They're getting that consistently across the community every year. And that's really a powerful thing, at least for kids to feel a sense of empowerment, knowledge, and hopefully sharing as early as possible a red flag.
Yeah, and I again, just highlighting, because on the one hand, I love the detail you put there, on the other hand, it makes me really sad, right?
Yeah.
But this idea that we need to make sure that we are talking about the difference between a safe adult and a trusted adult, because I
Yeah.
think, like, even for me, I would naturally go, a trusted adult, someone you can trust.
Yeah, yeah.
But no, it's
not helpful.
someone who's going to be safe.
Yeah.
Someone who's going to help you to be safe. And being that person for a child can also help to not only prevent bad situations from happening, but also if they are happening, get them out in the open more
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
And we do know from a lot of research, right? And you guys all know this, that the sooner we find out something's happening, the sooner we can get services in place, the more likely it is that we can stop awful things happening for 5 years, 10 years, and can stop that trauma quicker.
Right, it's not first level prevention, but it's still mitigation. You know,
Right.
we all know the incidence, especially of sexual abuse, of number of victims that a perpetrator has. So we really need a kid to disclose, and the sooner the better. Maybe one little anecdote about that. We piloted as a community, again, the first pre-K program of these safety rules. It's a Florida-based foundation that does this, and we said we need more in our community. We know our youngest kids are at risk. And 2 years ago, I got a call from a daycare teacher saying, hey, I just wanted to tell you about the success story. There was a little boy in kindergarten, and he was in my daycare, and he was part of the Elkhart County pilot. So he got the safety rules as a 4-year-old, first time. And he started kindergarten, and in his first week, something happened. And so do boys disclose as much as girls? No, we know that, right? Do little kids disclose as much as little kids? No. And he's in kindergarten. In his first week, he came home to his safe adult, which was his mom, he identified, and he told her something funny happened. And it was a red flag. That's what he learned in pre-K. Mom told the school investigated, it was a staff member, and they had 9 victims prior to that. And this little boy in his first week of kindergarten just said that was a red flag and told his mom because it was normalized for him. And so I think about that. Again, it's not, we want to be getting there early. We don't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not, for that child, that made sense to him that red flag was valid, and he would tell his mom because he had practiced that. It wasn't a big deal at some level. So that normalizing those kind of behaviors just makes me so happy that that kids can do that. And it's not a scary curriculum. A red flag could be a car is coming, little kids learn. It doesn't have to be someone is coming and asking you to do something like that. We normalize a lot of kind of safety behaviors with that.
Awesome. So the next question, and Justine, Ian, whoever wants to take this, but they're curious. The majority, we've established, the majority of trafficking cases, the perpetrator of the abuse is someone, either a family member, intimate partner, right, boyfriend. What about the rest? What else do you see that's beyond familial or intimate partner?
I'll start, then you can finish. All right. So I think what I see when you don't see like it being in those scenarios, and I will say those scenarios are the vast majority of what we serve. It's usually, I'm always looking for that older boyfriend, that older friend, those types of things. But sometimes you do have the kids, right? Where again, running away is typically the kind of gateway here, right? And so I think there's statistics out there that are going to say that, you know, within X number of hours, I think it's like 6-8 hours, right, that they're probably going to come across an unsafe adult, and potentially need to go and, you know, or be exploited through that unsafe adult. The biggest other piece I see is youth with substance abuse disorders, and so there's a lot of connection between kind of the drug world and exploitation, and how those are linked towards, sometimes it starts with, hey, if you do this, then I'll get you the drugs that you want, right? Or things like that. I think another piece of it is the internet safety, which I think, Ian, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we at ITVAP try to stay as much ahead of the game as possible. A lot of human trafficking is catch up, whether it be laws and services and things like that. We just developed a new training called Protecting Youth in the Digital Age, and it focuses on internet and online safety for youth. And we talk about dispelling internet rumors. We talk about the increase that COVID had on our children being online for schooling and whatnot. Some of the riskier ads or apps that have been used for trafficking, safety apps that are out there for children to guard against being recruited and groomed through online things. One thing in doing the research for that, there's a new form of grooming that has recently surfaced, and it's called anger bonding. And it was primarily found through online gaming platforms. And if you're familiar, you can play Xbox or PS5 with the world through the internet. Recruiters, traffickers would get on there and just make simple statements like, man, I hate my mom so much, she grounded me because X, Y, Z. Every teen, every adolescent at some point has been mad at their mom, dad, parent figure, and it's an easy thing to strike that conversation up, right? So yeah, me too. I hate my mom. She did this to me last week, and it can simply start from there. The grooming doesn't necessarily have to be like, hey, little kid, here's a piece of candy, come get in my van now, right? So they're always finding different ways to recruit and groom, and we try to do that. Or we try to stay ahead of that and inform you guys so that you guys can be aware. There's a lot of resources and what to do built into that training that we've created. And of course it starts with monitoring your kid's phone, first of all. Having conversations with them about safe adults on the internet, on what questions can be kind of leading or manipulative and things like that, and not sharing personal information. As far as child sexual exploitation material, never taking pictures of yourself and sending it to them. We researched a lot of that CSAM stuff. One of the most disturbing things I found in doing research for it was, I believe it was in Pennsylvania, there was a middle school, where there was a contest. So if girls sent pictures of themselves in sexually explicit ways, they would get a bracelet from the boys, and the girls with the most bracelets would be the winner of the game. And so it was normalized in some sort of sick, twisted contest for child sexual abuse material like that. And because all of their friends were participating, it was normal to them. They were just being competitive and playing a game with their peers, and as parents and caregivers, we need to recognize the signs and symptoms of that. And just a few simple ones are, if your teen or adolescent is switching screens as soon as you look at them, if they have advanced knowledge of overly sexual terms and things of that nature that are not age appropriate or you wouldn't expect them to know. If they always want to have screen time alone in the room or other parts of the house, gifts being sent to them through the mail, or if someone's adding money to an online gaming account or online account in some form that you don't know who that person is, it's not a safe adult or something like that. Just a few things for internet safety, but it really comes down to being honest, open, upfront, and monitoring. And sometimes as parents, we don't know what we don't know, right? Technology can pass us by in the blink of an eye, and sometimes it can be tough to keep up with that. So staying vigilant, knowing what's out there, and having honest conversations with your kids. And real-time preventative stuff for human trafficking too that we do for our youth is we have specific youth curriculums. It's called the What Would I Do curriculum. It is based for school-age children, either middle school, 5 to 8, or high school. And we go in there, and it's not the hit you in the face with the human trafficking stuff. It is based on healthy relationships, safe adults, and then talks about what human trafficking is. And I always tell my audience that the greatest thing that you guys can do as a preventative measure is be that safe adult in a youth's life. So volunteer, Boys and Girls Club at your kid's school, be that safe adult for that kid is what I always tell everybody is the best prevention method.
So kind of a follow-up question for you, Ian, quickly, because you went into this, right? And the question here, just to kind of read the whole thing, right, is how can I help parents understand the importance of monitoring their child's online activity? I think you just answered that, but the follow-up with that is there an app that you're aware of that we should encourage parents to download? And if so, would you share that? Inquiring minds want to know.
Sure. I think the one that has emerged, at least to me, as being the best app, and they've actually created their own phone, is the Bark app, B-A-R-K. Because they've created their own phone, it is already built in to monitor who is texting your child, what apps they are on, how long they're on, and you get reports sent to your phone through the account to know what sites they're visiting, what apps they're using. You have to give permission to download anything. There's ratings, scores, reviews for all different types of apps. You set the parameters. So if you don't want to use Bark, Apple and Verizon both have systems in place that you can go through your account and add on online safety. There's another one, the name is escaping me. Request the digital age training, and I'll remember it for you guys.
There you go.
I forget it right now, but yes, through your carriers and Bark would be my two recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're saying, well, how can I request that training from you? His cards are up here, but also if you download the resources, there's information on how to connect with the various regional coordinators for ITVAP. So just getting that plug in as well. Okay, so with that being said, kind of moving into a little bit of a different direction here. I'm curious about this one. Do you see, Ian, Justine, as you're working with these kids, any difference between the grooming process between male and female perpetrators? Okay, so yeah.
There are similarities between the two for sure, and I've seen, so one thing that we have to just recognize as we go into this conversation is male survivors are largely underreported. We are, I think in the last couple of years, hearing more and more stories. We're recognizing that boys can be trafficked. And so I think we always have to challenge our language. We have to challenge ourselves when it comes to, oh, it's just girls, or it's, this type of girl, right? We talked about some of the myths earlier, but in some of the ways in which boys are groomed versus girls are groomed, it is still largely, I think, through someone they believe is a trusted adult, or they're trusted people. One of the areas I've seen more with boys than with girls has been more of the internet, kind of some of the things that Ian just talked about. I think also when we talk about how girls are trafficked versus even those that are maybe in the LGBTQ plus population, there's a lot more of the internet kind of like connection for romantic or sexual relationships, and I think that has also been a driving force, because you can be anybody you want to be online, right? You can be any age, you can be anything, and so I see that more with our boys, especially I've worked with some boys who are in the LGBTQ plus population, that their drive was, it's not safe to be out in my school community or in my community as a large, but it's okay to be out and safe in the like online community, and then those relationships ended up leading to exploitation experiences. Do you have anything to add, Ian?
No, you nailed it.
All right, well, Justine's kind of sticking with you, I guess, at this point here. So, and I know the answer to this, but they don't, so I'm excited because this is a great question. Keep them coming, everybody. You've got great questions here. Do you think that adult survivors of human trafficking are assets and can be successful social workers in the human trafficking field? So, yeah.
Yes, that is the short answer. I think the longer answer to that is actually a really big important part of the rehabilitation experience for survivors of any age is connecting with survivors who we kind of call them survivor mentors, or those who have lived experience. There is, right, I'm a professional and our relationship is professional, right? I'm the program director of your program. I can empathize with what you've been through, but I have not experienced nearly what you've been through, right? And I think oftentimes some of our, and yes, both can be true, right? Someone can be, have lived experience and be open with that lived experience and being a social worker, and they can also have lived experience and not be open with that. And I think that's something to also remind ourselves, is that when we're in professional spaces, we don't know our own, like our colleagues' stories or their own lived experiences. And so one thing that's really important that I really try to drive in our program is how we speak about our clients, how we speak about survivors. We want to I'm always a big advocate for it. They need to be in the room when we're talking about their lives. We need to be in the room, and they need to be the front center voice to the decisions that are being made, because it's their life, it's not mine, right? I might have opinions clinically on what the best steps are, right? I might be the expert in which trauma modality will work best for them, but I'm certainly not an expert in their lives. And so I think what we've talked about too, is we kind of partnered, is this important piece of a lot of our survivors do need professionals in their lives, or need survivor mentors in their lives that can relate, right? And again, it's not that one lived experience is the same as another lived experience. In fact, they are two very different experiences, but it's really important that someone gets them on that level that isn't just a professional in the room. Does that make sense? And you can be both at the same time.
Ian has something, but as we pass the mic down, this is where I'll put a plug in for another one of our partner organizations who's not up here, but we have a mentorship agreement with Ascent 121 out of Indianapolis, and they're one of the leaders in the field. And every year they have a conference. It's normally a 2-day conference down in the Indianapolis area. And one of the things that has impacted me the most in my education is how they have brought in survivors who are experts in the field, who can share from their perspective, not just what they've been through, but also how they healed, and then how they are able to be survivor mentors. But in almost all of these cases, these individuals, to your question, can they be effective social workers? They're far more effective as social workers than I am, and certainly for this population, just an amazing gift to be able to be in that role. So, Ian?
Yeah, so I have two things to say about that. The first, as our organization runs, we have worked with multiple lived experience experts. We have 2 on our staff now that have lived experience that are employed at ITVAP. They have been fantastic contributors. Their lived experience offers something that, as we've explained, we cannot offer. the most paramount thing is their survivor safety, right? Because them providing trainings, talking about situations, can relive their past trauma. So they need to, along with whatever services they are still currently receiving, and along with their working colleagues and professional environment, need to make sure that their safety is always ensured. Because we've worked with another consultant who was ready and willing and able to do the work to help present, to relive his experience with being trafficked, and then did it and was not safe in that space doing that, and needed to step back and realize that he was not ready, and maybe he wouldn't be ready, although willing and wanted to. So survivor safety is paramount there too.
Yeah, and as Justine does that, I'm sure you're going to dive into this, but I want to highlight what you both just said there is putting their well-being first, right? And sometimes we have to support them in that, but we also can't be paternalistic in that. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of speak to one of the things I think we hear a lot, or the myths that are out there, is that if we have lived experience in an area, we can't be objective in providing services or in being a professional in that space. And I think while we all have to look internally and know what our own biases are, I think, Ian, when you talked about survivor safety, I think it's really valid, really important that we also treat experts, lived experience experts, the same way or even better than we would treat professional experts. So in our world, a lot of times whenever we have someone with lived experience that provides a testimony or a story or contributes in any way, shape, or form to development of programs, we pay them consultation and expert fees because they are an expert, right? And so I think a lot of times that's what I've really been fortunate enough to hear around is we want them engaged and involved, but sometimes we don't value the experience that they're bringing to the table just because they don't have the degree or the credentialing, but they have better credentialing than I do, if that makes sense. So I think also just recognizing and realizing that some of the piece of survivor safety is that we always have to seek to not re-exploit in the way that we engage survivors, whether they're in treatment currently in our programs, we're working with them in services, or if they're coming into our multidisciplinary teams or coming into spaces as professionals, that their experience is even more valued than my experience in the field. And ideally, I would love every program, everybody who's working with, every agency that's working with survivors to have lived experienced folks on staff, because I think they just provide such a unique perspective.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, so a couple of statistics questions for you, Ian. Are you ready? You got to put your math hat on.
Okay.
So what they want to know. First, what are Indiana's statistics compared to other states regarding trafficking? So let's just even say within our region, things like that.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, since 2015, 8,000 plus kids have been provided services through our organization. As a region, as a state, Indianapolis has the highest area, and we see that pretty consistently throughout the country because those cities that have highest populations have a high density of everything going on, right? Good, bad, and different. And it's no different with Indiana. We see the most cases coming out of Indianapolis. A lot of the referrals and things that I get of that nature come from, at least recently, have been labor trafficking out of my more rural counties in northern Indiana. We're seeing immigrants come, and they are 14, 15-year-old kids who are working in cornfields or factories and things like that. A lot of reports have been made involving labor trafficking in our youth recently. We are on par with the rest of the states in the country as far as number of referrals and statistics that we see. I don't have a number breakdown. It's not necessarily comparative, but I will tell you guys, if you go to polaris.org, POLARIS, they are a global agency that does a really good job of compiling the best available data on human trafficking, which is difficult in itself to come by. And then Shared Hope also does gradings and report cards of each state to assess where they're at in reporting victims, providing them with services, and overall outcomes of cases such as that. So those are two great sites for kind of climate or a scale on where we are. I myself, as I train and as I present human trafficking, I do not specifically focus on statistics because, as we've explained, numbers are so grossly underreported. The problem is much larger than we see in numbers and in percentages, that it doesn't affect the work that I do, except to see positive trends. So just because Indiana would fall 32nd on a list or something like that for cases reported, doesn't mean that Indiana is not a place where human trafficking is happening, to me, because statistics are not a direct indicator of what's actually happening with human trafficking.
Yeah. And I put up a slide here that Justine actually had put together, and so feel free to take a picture of it and we can come back to it, but it's some great resources as well, including the Polaris Project, which Ian mentioned, if you'd like to educate yourself further. So thank you for that. So one question that, again, is for really everybody here, and it's a great question about minority victims and survivors, and really it's kind of twofold, blending two questions. One is, do we see in the state data any racial disparity that you're aware of in terms of that? So I'll let you answer that briefly, and then I'll come back for part two. Absolutely.
So the 8,000 victims that we've served, we have direct data on that. The population of Indiana youth is 67% white. Of the 8,000 victims that we have seen come through our doors, 37%, I should finish that first statistic, 67% white, and then 27% African American, according to state data. And this is in my slide, and I'm trying to do it from memory, but of the 8,000 kids that we've seen, 37% are African American, 27% are Latinx. So the disparity, and only 14% are white. So the disparity between the overall population versus what we've seen and provided services for do not match up. Those marginalized communities are being trafficked more often than the white community, and that's just a fact of what our data has shown.
Okay, and so then the follow-up question to that, and it specifically relates to maybe families where the parents may not speak English very well, if at all. Do your organizations have staff who are fluent in Spanish so that they can engage those families and can provide services to those families? And again, predominantly the question was related to Spanish, but we also know it's not exclusively with that being the second language. So.
I would add to the last question on disproportionality. I think it's also what we see is, poverty is a real driving factor of risk, and I'm broadening here to child abuse as well. And so where poverty follows, that's another lens you could use. Families and kids are at more risk. And so that may follow racial trends or may not, but that's another thing that we look for, at least I look for. So how do we respond to people who don't speak English in other cultures? So, for example, we can do forensic interviews in the languages that the children speak, whether that's in-person translation or that's kind of via an off-site translator. In terms of the broader work that we're doing in child abuse prevention, and sometimes that's more upstream, Half our staff in our frontline programs speak Spanish because we have a large Spanish population in Elkhart County, and so we deliver Spanish services in person. We also have Ukrainian and Russian and Haitian populations in our county. I was out doing some Haitian Creole translating last week, so we work to be responsive to the community, and kind of that's a growing edge of our work, to meet the family and child where they're at as comfortably as we can and provide Spanish services in their native language.
I know none of you had Rebecca speaking Haitian Creole on your bingo card today, but it is a little known fact, but it's pretty impressive, right, Justine?
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle, right? Is if you can't communicate well and you don't have someone who speaks your native language, there's a lot more room for misinterpretation, things like that. So we also commit to ensuring that we have people who can translate, specifically Spanish. We've also used like off-site translators as well. So very similar to what you guys are doing. I think we always can grow and learn and have more of a diverse population of staff and availability, because Spanish is probably our primary need in terms of translation, but there are plenty of other clients that we've served that also have other language barriers. And I will say it is also a cultural thing that we have to make sure that we are educating ourselves around that family culture and some of those things, and making sure that doesn't impede our work, because we have seen that as well, where there's been specific situations where kind of some cultural pieces of someone's heritage has gotten in the way and has made a parent or a kid or the behaviors look worse than they are. And so we always have to kind of think through hey, is this, I had to check myself to make sure that we're also making sure that we're being open to other traditions and things like that. And that's a huge part of treatment, because that is our identity, right? It's a huge part of our identity. And in my world, I think the trafficker and exploiter comes in to strip identity away often, right? So that they can keep the youth compliant and things like that. And so for us, sometimes we are exploring what are the things you like to do, what are the things you enjoy doing, right? But also what parts of your heritage, your family, your culture that are incredibly important to you, whether that be holidays you celebrate or different things like that.
Wonderful. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I think that's going to give us time for about 2 last questions here. So I will say, if you have a question we haven't been able to get to, please feel free to catch any one of us as soon as we're done. We'd be happy to answer it, or even take it down and get you the right answer, okay? But Justine, I'm going to stick with you, and then we're going to end with Rebecca, I think, for the last question here. But this is a great question about how do you do therapy in the midst of all of this? And so really, here's how it's worded. How do you know which questions cannot be asked or which topics should be avoided when doing, for example, TFCBT or EMDR with a child in a therapeutic setting? So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have 2 therapists that we work with in our program that I would call them experts with this work. And when I'm meeting with them and we're talking through here's this very sticky situation, right? Because as a therapist, first and foremost, your job is to build what we call therapeutic rapport, right? Most of your students in the room or have been and understand that phrasing, right? And a lot of that is just meeting the client where they're at and providing them space to tell you or talk to you about what it is they want to work on, their goals, how their trauma has impacted them, right? But it's also that piece of the puzzle of we have to be careful what we are asking, what we are doing, right? And so I think a lot of it is going back to some of that training that we get about not asking leading questions, letting the client come to you. Most of my therapists use a lot of motivational interviewing to try to really elicit not just motivation, but really build that relationship and that trust that, hey, we have confidence in here. You also know the rules of confidentiality, right? So, and I do think when there are disclosures that arise, that can be really tricky for our therapists, because there are probably hundreds of pieces of paper on a child for what they've ever disclosed or not disclosed. And so sometimes as you're going through that trauma work, it can be really difficult for the kids, one, to trust that they can explore it, that they can, right? And I know for us, that means being honest with the child when it's hey, this is something that we're going to have to report, almost stopping the child in the moment to say, hey, I just want to remind you This sounds like something we haven't talked about before. And so we always try to include, like, when a disclosure happens, I don't know if that's part of the question, but when a disclosure happens is to help the child be a part of that reporting process whenever we can. Hey, can we call the DCS hotline together? Would you like to read the email notification I have to send to your DCS worker? Would you like to help me write it? To provide them a part of that empowerment of, like, yes, you're reporting, right? But I think when it comes down to that nitty-gritty, like, trauma work, right? We're in it, we're doing these types of things. I think a lot of it really comes down to navigating where the kid is at and where they want to go and how they want to do it, and always turning whatever they're processing through trauma work, whatever they're doing in that, turning it into an empowerment experience for them. So we've had some youth that have identified the in vivo work is really important to them, and they need to go back into spaces safely with a therapist, with their trusted staff. And again, in that moment, we're not focusing so much on, hey, you went to this space and you did it, right? It was that you went to this space and you can cope through this, and what is it that what are you feeling right now? How are you managing this? What do you need? And then also turning it into, now this isn't just a space that's gonna cause you stress, right? This is a space that you can reclaim, and how do we do that? So I think a lot of it is that in vivo work. And so, when it really comes down to, like, navigating those sticky conversations, right? It's really more about being honest, direct, and helping the youth to say, we all have rules to our jobs, right? And so I'm not gonna ask you questions that, that really need to be asked by the forensic interviewer. We also have to work, we work in a multidisciplinary team, not just inside our agency, but collaboratively across systems. And that is purposeful, and that is the evidence-based practice, because it's important to note that my role as a therapist is not to investigate. So it is, I train my therapist to say, you take the information, we make the report, and then we let CAPS handle the rest, right? We let law enforcement handle the rest. But we also look to, how do we support that youth through that process, because it's a very difficult process for them.
Yeah, go ahead and pass it down to Ian. I think, my experience is you take what's freely offered, right? If the child's talking, you're not doing anything wrong by listening. But what you want to do is make sure that you stay in a therapist mindset of listening to the client and not flipping into an investigator or an interrogator mindset, which is terrible practice for any therapy, right? But it's natural, I think, in these situations to say, like, oh, I want to help. Just remind yourself, you might not be helping if you flip into the investigator mindset. Yeah.
Right, so we've talked about not being investigators and all that good stuff, and for those of us who are not therapists, I always explain to my audience, there's 3 simple rules to follow. You're gonna be non-judgmental, non-punitive, and ask open-ended questions. You need nothing more in a case management, therapeutic and all those techniques. That's for its own space and its own time. If you are a case management and you have a client and you suspect trafficking is going on, non-judgmental, non-punitive, open-ended.
Wonderful. So we're going to end with this question for you, Rebecca. Well, actually, I've got it twofold, because I am curious on this one. This question is, can you speak on any dangers that can arise by a parent posting their children on social media? And so, Ian, I don't know if you have any insights into this too, but I am curious about this because, admittedly, in my biased worldview, my wife and I go to the other extreme of we basically try to post nothing or very little. But what do you guys know about that? Is there any proven evidence that it is dangerous for a parent to overpost about their kid on social media?
So this is up to the parents, right? There's no, DCS isn't gonna knock on your door if you're posting pictures of your child's face and likeness and name and address and school and little league they play at. That's not a crime. That's not an indicator that there is abuse or that there is going to be abuse. I'll tell you that obviously everything leaves an online footprint, and if a trafficker, if a predator wants to go and search around, they may find it. The responsibility, I don't want to say risk, because it's not inherently risky to post pictures and celebrate your family's lives and things like that online. But we know that there's very unsafe people out there that could use that material in a negative manner. I personally have not dealt with any cases of trafficking that have come from just images of a child being online through normal posts and family and birthday and things like that. That has not come across my desk. There are communities and things like that in the virtual world that exist to share that information, but just because you post your kid's Facebook or birthday on Facebook isn't a gigantic red flag that they could be trafficked.
Well,
I just haven't seen that.
And I appreciate that, because that's part of our goal, is to dispel myths, right? And so that's good. Rebecca, go ahead, yeah?
Just two additions. I very much agree with Ian. So again, 93% of kids are abused and exploited by someone they know well, which is, Facebook is not changing that,
Yeah.
right? So I think of that, but then the second piece that I do encourage parents to think about, we really say teach consent from an early age. So what I've started doing with my kids, I have a 7, 8-year-old, and I'll say, I'd like to take a picture of you. I also fall in the paranoid camp and don't post anything, but can I take a picture of you? And I allow them to say yes or no. It doesn't go anywhere other than maybe their grandparents, but think of consent for online Facebook, because it's a really important concept we want to start earlier on with. Again, back to those safety rules, we also teach our kids and our family, when they see grandma, they can high five, wave, or hug, but they don't have to hug her because that's their own body. We're trying to model that they cannot consent if someone who they think of in a safe adult role is not being safe. So I think of that as kind of something to consider both for your clients and family, that like kids should consent. It's a good practice because the stakes are low as a parent. You want them to not consent and know they have that right to do that as well. Practice that behavior.
Yeah, and so sticking with that as we kind of end here, actually, Rebecca, would be any other tips, and you led right into it, but the question verbatim was this. Can you speak, not that one, can you share the safety language you use that we can use in our own homes with our own kids? And I think that is a great one to end on, because to Justine's slide here, we can all be the one, right? We can all be the one safe adult, but certainly, hopefully, if we've got kids in our own house, we want to be the safe adult for our own kids. How can we do that?
It depends on the developmental age of your kid, but I try just as a baseline to normalize it. So we're out to eating Mexican food the other night, and the kids brought up some incident where a kid was mean. And so I try to tee right into that without being scary. Yeah, mean, and if they scare you, what could that be a safety rule? That's the language they're using. And they say, yeah. And I said, and could that be a red flag? And they say, yeah. And I said, what are the red flags? Do you remember them? And then they go back and forth, and then we share some examples. So there's a lot of ways to do that. I would say normalizing, not freaking kids out early and often, clear communication without going to sexual predator, right? Start with things that are not going to freak them out, like every kid learns to check both ways to cross the street. Put that scaffold into other things. Then I always use example of people they know. So, if, Uncle Peter did something that was a red flag, who would you tell? What's the talk it up? Again, that's a safety rule. Who are your safe adults? And then they think about it. We just try to normalize it. So there can be a lot more to it, but simplifying, developmentally appropriate, early and often, without freaking out your kids and making it the birds and the bees talk when you turn 13 and everyone's like, we don't want to do that with safety. We want that to be embedded in our language so that it's part of kind of how we talk as a family.
Awesome. So thank you all. We could have gone on forever, probably, or at least a few more hours. A couple of other things here. Again, those resources, please feel free to QR code that, but then how to help, right? Very simply, if you see something, if you suspect something, report it, right? 1-800-800-5556. If it's an immediate danger, right? We started off by saying this isn't Taken. We all also are not Liam Neeson, and so if you see something, I've had people who have said this, right? Well, if I see something, what should I do? Should I go after him? No. You should call 911. Let the people who are trained take care of it, right? But I want to just end with this, right? Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for caring enough about this topic to come and to learn about it. Be the change we want to see in our community. If nothing else, I can't even begin to thank, the IU School of Social Work and ITVAP and CAPS, and then Justine, having had a chance to work with her for 12 years. It doesn't seem possible, because I'm not that much older than I was when we met, but collaboration's the key, right? No one of us can change the bad stuff that happens in the world by ourselves, but if we work together, we collaborate, and you heard a lot of that today, we can make real change on these things that ill society, these things that we like to lie to ourselves and say, oh, that doesn't happen, that happens somewhere else, right? It doesn't happen here. No, unfortunately, child abuse and neglect broadly, and human trafficking specifically, it does happen in our community. But if we want that to not be the case, the best way for us to make that change is to work together to make that possible. So you're all a part of that by being here today. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists, please?